The Odyssey radar screen crackled like metal tapping against the ship's side. Jonathan had heard it for 3 nights straight since Remember first appeared, when the plasma flies had swarmed around the drone 9-08, when the giant plasma creature had hovered like a ghost in the sea of algae. Now Remember returned, but this time with coordinates. A long string of numbers stuck straight up on the radar, flashing red like a bloodstain on the map of Zorathia. Mark leaned against the console, eyes unblinking. It's sending out directions. It's giving directions. Mark said it with a quaver in his voice, like a child finding his way in a dark forest. Ben stood by the window watching, not turning around, just sniffing. Show me the way, or drag me down the hole where it hides its teeth. Jonathan crossed his arms, looking at the radar screen. The coordinates were deeper than any of their previous dives near a bio-canyon they'd seen faintly on drone Husho-5. No one dared to get close. The plasma around the fissure was thick, the light shifting constantly like living skin. Mark leaned towards Jonathan, his eyes flashing like plasma. Jonathan, this could be the first door. This is the first time Zorathia has taken the initiative to invite me inside. If I don't dive down, all these years of observation will be for nothing. Ben spun around. Did you forget Vaughn's orders? Do not step out of the module. Do not risk touching deep biology. Drones count. Drone Amrazo 8 is already hit by plasma fragments, and now you want drone number 9 to float down into the bowels of the planet. You think we have the machinery to pull it up in time for the data-hungry plasma. The air in the Odyssey cabin suddenly felt stuffy. Radar flashes of green and red. Outside the module window, Zorathia floated silently, a sea of dimly glowing plasma clouds, like a giant living cortex circling the Odyssey's orbit. Jonathan exhaled softly, pulled back his sleeve and pressed 2 fingers to the console. A hologram window popped up. Vaughn sent the log. Ben pushed his glasses up his nose and nodded curtly. The message was 1 sentence. Gather data, no contact, no risk, no departure from drone beyond safe limits. Mark chuckled. Safety threshold. Vaughn has never seen Zorathia's plasma. He just sits in a leather chair, typing checks. He has never heard the radar say, "Welcome home," never seen the drone vibrate like a heartbeat. Jonathan remained silent. He turned the screen toward Mark. And you never lost a drone that brought a life signal back to Earth. Once it returns, it's not just a machine, it's a seed. Mark swallowed. Inside the cabin, the radar went from click to longer pings, red coordinates, flashing, then off, then back on, as if someone down in the canyon was flipping a navigation switch. Jonathan slowly pressed the activation key, drone Hammerzo 9 ready. The secondary screen displayed a series of parameters: thermal tolerance, diving depth, isolated memory. He checked each item like an old teacher reviewing an old lesson. Drone Sarso 9 will come down. But only observe, only scan 3 times, no deep probe insertion, no raw sample collection. Understand. Mark pursed his lips. Ben sneered. It better scan and come straight up. This thing isn't just sending a signal, it's calling someone. Jonathan glanced up at the radar, looking at Zorathia out the window. The sea of plasma below flickered slightly as if in response. In his mind, only 1 sentence repeated. Observation begins with seeing. But the price of seeing is the door is no longer locked. Drone Heroes 09 left the Odyssey module in silence. There were no cheers, no countdowns, just the Odyssey radar flashing, tracking the palm-sized dot of light as it skimmed the edge of the plasma cloud. Jonathan stood in front of the screen hands in the pockets of his lab coat, thumbs brushing the edge of his pockets, a habit he had when trying to keep from saying the wrong thing. Mark was like a child glued to the control panel, his back-hunched eyes flashing after the drone dots on the radar. The drone began to lose altitude. At a depth of 300 meters below the luminescent cloud layer, the plasma thickened, the light no longer spread out evenly, Like a thin curtain, it was as thick as condensed night dew, winding into spirals around the drone's body. Each time the ion fan gently beat, the plasma pulsated and closed itself like a wound healing itself. "It's breathing," Mark muttered, not taking his eyes off the camera feed. Ben bit his lip, lowering his voice. "No, it's swallowing." "You think it's a cloud? Look at it." The plasma hugs the drone's wings like algae on a boat's hull. It keeps the drone in the exact rhythm it wants. Jonathan looked down at the gauges. The descent rate was slowing, but all ionization readings were still safe. The drone's circuits hadn't shorted out, the carbon shell hadn't been corroded by plasma, at least not yet. Technically, drone Hosho 9 was still healthy. But everything alive around it, the plasma circuits, the crystals, the ionized mist filaments, was healthier than it. 500 meters deep. The drone panned its camera down. Below, the black rock was glowing with a faint pink light, not a reflected light, but a light emitted from the cracks in the rock. A long crack ran no more than a few meters wide, but as deep as the Mariana Trench on Earth. Mark pushed a button, zooming in on the camera feed. They saw streaks of light running along the walls of the crevice, winding like underground veins. In the purple-blue light, there were occasional plasma particles like charged spermatozoa swimming up the cliff. "This place isn't dead rock, it's electrified," Ben muttered. Jonathan glanced at the radar. "Remember," flashed across the screen, "no more steady ping." Now it vibrated in thick, high-frequency waves, almost overlapping like a whisper in his ear. The drone rotated its light, scanning. The light touched the wall, reflecting off a patch of undulating surface that looked like a rock ledge. But as the drone drifted closer, the camera feed became clearer. It wasn't natural rock. It was bright veins clinging to a network. One side of the wall was alive. The surface pulsated slightly like the skin of an artery, the light moving inside like blood containing millions of luminescent spots. Mark exclaimed softly, "See, Jonathan. This isn't a cave, this is a bio-storage facility." Ben frowned, pushing Mark away from the console. "The tunnel or the intestines are the same. Once the drone is deep inside, we are no longer observers, but the ones being digested." Jonathan didn't reply. He just slowly placed his finger on the lock button for the drone's speed. A command to keep the drone from falling freely. The surface of the crevice was still heaving, as if waiting for someone to insert a breathing tube. The Odyssey radar gave a short hiss. The remember frequency flared into a red band. The coordinates shifted a few degrees to the left. Below the camera feed, a narrow opening appeared, two plasma walls parted slightly, like arteries expanding as the drone approached. Mark held his breath. It opened the door. Ben hissed through gritted teeth. "You think it opened the door for me? Or did it open it to swallow me?" Jonathan bowed his head, looking at the camera feed. The lights flashed like eyes without lids, without pupils, but still staring straight at the drone. In his head, remember was no longer a wave. It was a soft whisper. "Come in. Remember me. I used to remember you." He swallowed. His fingers still held the lock button. Drone number 9 hovered at the opening, waiting for a final command. Go forward or turn back. Drone number 9 passed through the narrow gap, its blue light scanning the surrounding surface. A faint, pulse-like movement echoed through the audio feed. Mark leaned close to the screen, whispering as if afraid his voice would distract the drone. The walls on both sides were no longer rough like ordinary stone. The drone camera zoomed in, the surface was undulating like vascular tissue. Under the gray-black skin was a blue light flowing in threads. Each time the drone passed by, the threads contracted, then expanded in a rhythmic rhythm, like an artery slowly pumping plasma. Jonathan tilted his head. His eyes were fixed on the vein of light, and he muttered, "This is no longer a crevice in the rock. This is an artery. Zorathia has blood vessels. A wall on the left slid slightly. The drone adjusted its camera. The light swept across a spiral indentation, almost a shallow carving. But as the drone closed in, the feed sharpened. The indentation was a double helix, as long as a strand of DNA etched into the moving plasma. Mark slammed his hand on the console. The living gene. Jonathan, you see, it's not just vascular tissue, it carries genes. Ben breathed through gritted teeth. Stop getting excited. Who carved genes into the planet's gut? Or did this thing carve itself? Jonathan pressed the key. The data feed showed the plasma wave layer. Drone Nogers 09 automatically scanned the biological spectrum. The Odyssey screen lit up, Bioscan active. A thin, green laser beam scanned the double helix. Data streamed out in a string of numbers. Mark laughed. His eyes didn't blink. The code read adenine, thymine, cytosine, guanine. But after 12 base pairs, Jonathan paused. A short segment was a 100% match to the DNA sequence Voyager had brought back from Earth. The drone scanned another 50 base pairs, a 90% match. A small variation in odd protein insertion not found in any Earth genome database. Jonathan looked at Mark. Mark turned to Ben. Ben clenched his fists on the rail next to the cabin. The Odyssey radar pinged, remember, flashed. It seemed Zorathia wasn't just emitting a signal. It was replaying the Earth gene, returning it to the observer. Drone and by Zo 9 sticks to the wall, the probe scanning a few millimeters deeper. The scanning light pans over a transparent membrane. Below, the camera catches a streak of protein like a worm of light slowly circling the vascular tissue. Mark swallowed. His voice dropped. It's not blood, it's nerves, it's carrying genes, it's moving data. Jonathan exhaled slow and long. The Odyssey ceiling light reflected the sweat that clung to his temples. He tapped the keys, zooming in on the feed. The protein twisted, heaved then, split into two, like a gene replicating itself, but made of living plasma. Ben cursed. Get the drone up, Jonathan. Pull it out now. This thing doesn't just carry a signal, it copies it. Don't you see? Mark snapped back, his voice cracking. It's the data. We've been searching for Voyager for years. The Voyager signal is dead, only the carrier wave remains. But here, the entire base pair sequence is preserved, embedded in living tissue. This is how Zorathia maintains her memory. Jonathan listened to the argument, but the Odyssey radar pinged slowly in its own stream in his ears. On the screen, the camera feed slowly panned to the right, a double helix carving leading into a small alcove like a cave entrance within a larger cavern. In the cavity, the drone's lights dimmed, but the light inside was self-emitting. A faint pink glow winding like a nerve clung to small crystals. Looking closely, the crystals were arranged in rings. The outer ring was engraved with dots and lines like letters. The inner ring held living proteins that moved like ants. Jonathan whispered, almost afraid the crew would hear. This is not just a structure. This is a living library. Mark nodded vigorously. Zorathia doesn't use hard drives. It doesn't use servers. It uses plasma, vascular tissue, proteins, genes. Everything we emit doesn't disappear. It's copied. It's stored in the flesh. Ben pressed the drone stop button. The lock drone command line flashed red. Drone Brumsio 9 is not moving. Enough. Jonathan, if you let the probe touch the circuit inside, the drone will have its original data swallowed. Zorathia will rewrite the entire drone's memory. When it surfaces, it will bring that memory to the Odyssey. Jonathan looked up slowly, green lights flashing on the cabin glass. The camera feed locked on the final image protein strands like snakes of light swimming around the crystal. On the radar, remember was no longer flashing, it was a stream. Remember, 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 Mark whispered softly, almost whispering into the cabin wall. Zorathia doesn't just live, she remembers. And now she's teaching me to remember her. Jonathan closed his eyes. In his mind, the double helix streaked his thoughts like ink on vascular tissue. He knew if drone H09 moved another half-meter, the probe would sink into the protein's cavity, and Odyssey would not just observe. Odyssey would bring Zorathia's memories back to Earth, but if she stopped, would Zorathia leave the drone alone? The radar pings were long and breathy. On the screen, the camera feed froze the protein streak in the small hole still moving as if looking directly at the drone. Jonathan whispered almost to himself, Okay, Zorathia. What else do you remember inside the Odyssey cabin? The air seemed to thicken into a mist. Jonathan stood still, his eyes fixed on the camera feed that was zooming in on the living wall. The protein thread still swirled around the crystal, the light glowing like veins under his skin. Mark hunched over, almost pressing his face to the screen, while Ben tightened his grip on the drone's lock button. But the lock light was no longer red. It was blinking yellow as if waiting for a final command. Drone H09, ready to plug in probe. Sample acquisition. Mark barely whispered, but his voice echoed in the cabin like a whip cracking on static radar. Jonathan didn't respond. He just looked at Ben. Ben shook his head, his hand still pressed firmly on the lock button, touching a living wall. "You're crazy." Ben breathed heavily. Sweat soaked through the collar of his protective gear. He'd seen drone H08 lose contact, just a swarm of plasma flies swarming around it. The radar suddenly silent, the camera catching a glimpse of the creature before it went black. Now, 09 wasn't just swimming in the plasma, it was pressing its face against Zorathia's gut, where remember was no longer a signal, but a command. Jonathan leaned over and slowly touched the confirm probe button. The secondary screen widened. Probe arm ready. A tiny arm, like a nanoneedle, popped out from under the drone's belly. The probe's green light flickered, scanning the twitching protein strand inside the slot. "The sample will separate into tissue." "I don't pull deep." Jonathan said it, but he could hear the tremor in his voice. Outside, plasma pulsated around the drone like a film of water. Mark nodded slightly, his eyes red with excitement. This is the first time. A living protein strand. Zorathia DNA. Just a small sample, Jonathan. One sample is enough to change the entire biological history of Earth. Ben slammed his hand on the console. One sample is enough to drag the Odyssey to the bottom. Touch it and it will crawl back. Don't you see that Zorathia doesn't give data, it exchanges data? The deeper the drone scans, the more it scans us back. But it was too late. The probe tip gently penetrated the living wall. A plasma particle clung to the probe tip like a bubble on a needle. The camera feed shook slightly. The living wall pulsated, the double helix gene trace visible like a fingerprint on a soft surface. On the Odyssey radar, the remember wave changed rhythm. The green ping turned red, the horizontal stripe ran, repeating, "Remember, remember, remember." Jonathan whispered, "Cut the sample, just 1 microgram." Mark pressed the button. Drone H09 vibrated slightly, the probe cutting across the protein fibers. A thin plasma beam shot out from the narrow gap, clinging to the probe like a bright spider web. And then the Odyssey data feed went haywire. The screen showed probe data, but the number kept growing. Instead of just 1 microgram, the probe tip sucked back a tiny stream of plasma, and at the same time the living wall bulged slightly as if sucking back the Odyssey radar signal itself. Ben yelled, "Disconnect the probe. Jonathan, the drone is out of control." Jonathan raised his hand to punch the eject probe button, but the camera feed suddenly shifted focus through the hole, where the protein strand split the lens, flashed a dusky pink light blurring the inner wall, And there, under the thick layer of plasma shadows, appeared, in the shape of cheekbones, the bridge of the nose, the eye sockets. Mark shed tears in shock. What? Human. Who left a human figure in Zorathia's intestines. The radar screen pings repeatedly, "Welcome home. Welcome home." But the text suddenly breaks in two, distorting into "We wait, we wait." Jonathan looked at the fixed image. The face was hidden inside the wall, half fossil, half plasma tissue sewing itself to cover the human figure. The eyes were deep sockets. The mouth was a slit that had not yet closed. Ben punched the eject button. There was a dry hiss, and the probe was ricocheted off the wall. Plasma particles passed through the drone's body, exploding in a soft blue flash. The camera feed blurred for 0.3 seconds, then sharpened the broken protein still clinging to the probe's tip. On the Odyssey, the cabin shook slightly as if someone was pounding on the ship's wall. The radar flashed red, "Remember." "We wait." Mark stuttered, eyes fixed on the human feed. "Jonathan, Zorathia doesn't save the signal. It saves the person." Jonathan bowed his head. For the first time, he could see the fear no longer lurking in the data. It was clinging to the Odyssey's glass, to the radar, to his back. In his chest, he could feel his pulse pulsing in time with the "Remember" waves out there. The Odyssey radar hissed, then stopped. The cabin was filled with the sound of 3 people breathing. The camera feed showed drone number 09 hovering a probe, dangling a piece of protein and flickering green light. Under the vascular wall, the human figure was still blurry. Half the face melted into the plasma like a ghost sewn with nerve fibers. Mark sat down on the floor of the cabin, his back against the radar window. His face was red with excitement, his eyes sparkling like a child seeing heaven. "You see, Jonathan, it's not a rock. It's a person. A person. Zorathia stores people like a signal. It doesn't just remember radio waves. It remembers biologically." Ben slammed his hand on the edge of the console. The metallic clang echoed through the cabin, startling Jonathan. "So, what, Mark? You want to dive deeper. You want the drone to swim straight into that cavity, bringing the plasma biosphere into this ship." Mark jumped up, almost shouting back, "You don't understand. This is Voyager alive. This is the genetic legacy of the swallowed Earth. Now it's letting us see it again." Zorathia didn't kill the signal. It kept it and returned it to anyone brave enough to reach deep. Ben gritted his teeth, cutting Mark off. "And you believe it for free. Did you forget about drone 08? Forget about the plasma that surrounded the module 2 nights ago. Once drone 09 makes contact, it doesn't return to this module like a drone. It returns like an infected particle." Jonathan held up a hand to silence them both. He cut the camera feed, turning on a separate monitor that showed the probe data stream back to the Odyssey. Thousands of base pairs scrolled by. 10% Voyager matches, 20% unknowns, 30% never seen before. In the cabin, the radar voice turned the sonar very low. "Remember, we wait," like the sound of a heartbeat in the ship's chest. He pressed the call button. Hologram Nicholas Vaughn popped up in the middle of the cabin. The cold blue light of the projection screen swept across Jonathan's forehead, illuminating the pale half of Mark's face. Vaughn looked as he always did, gray suit, open collar face as clean as a CEO's who'd never had space dust in his hair. "Odyssey. I see feed drone 09. Close probe, collapse, spin up." Vaughn's voice was as dry as a match paper. Mark jumped up. "You don't understand. Nicholas, we're looking at the living genome. We're reaching the biological library. Just one more scan, just one." Vaughn tilted his head, his eyes as unfocused as if he were reading a stock report. "Mark, you were hired to watch, not to play God. Drone number 09 is down past the threshold. If the drone is swallowed by vascular tissue, Odyssey will be a walking blastocyst, I don't pay for stupid risks. Ben chuckled. You hear that, Mark? He's right. Once a drone is infected, it doesn't fly alone. Mark shook his head, his voice hissing through his teeth. Vaughn doesn't understand. He's sitting in the leather chair, looking at the numbers. And we're standing right in front of the door Zorathia opened. Who opened it? It opened it. Remember is the command continue. Drone, Yarzo 9 has been accepted by it. It's only invited it once. If we pull the drone up now, Zorathia will lock this door forever. Jonathan stood still as a statue. His ears were ringing as the tiny radar wave kept whirring. Remember, we wait. Part of him understood Mark. Part of him understood Ben. And Vaughn's cold shadow still cast a holographic blue glow across his cheek, like an iron hand squeezing Odyssey from Earth. Vaughn moved closer to the camera. Drone, Row 9 has enough data. Odyssey is back in orbit safely. Don't make me cut the supply line. Jonathan, listen. Mark jumped up, pounding his chest. Jonathan, please, just one more minute. Give it one more scan, one last scan. Ben reached out and placed his hand on Jonathan's shoulder, his voice hoarse. Close the door, Jonathan. Don't let that thing miss me more. Jonathan closed his eyes. The blurry figure in the veiny wall still flickered in his mind. A streak of pink plasma slithered around an anonymous cheek. Remember, we wait, was no longer a signal, it was a call winding around his spine. He opened his eyes slowly, pushing the Vaughn hologram aside. His eyes looked at Mark, then at Ben. His voice was low. I'll pull the drone. But I still have another eye to see. Mark slumped breathing like a man who had lost his planet. Ben squeezed Jonathan's shoulder but didn't smile. Vaughn was silent. The holograms faded, leaving only the Odyssey cabin darkening to the rhythm of the radar pings. The camera feed pans to the last image. The probe still sways the protein fibers. In the wall, the human figure is blurred, but the light on the radar still whispers, Remember, we wait. Jonathan whispered just to himself. Zorathia opened the door once. It will not remain closed. Drone Yarzo 9 began to slowly rise from the vascular tissue gap. The roar of the ion engines mingled with the crackling plasma waves through the living wall. The camera feed still panned downward. Through the dim sweep of the light, the humanoid had disappeared, or rather, it had melted into the tissue wall, leaving no trace but the whispering pulse of plasma. On the Odyssey radar, the red streak continued to streak across. Remember, we wait. The signal didn't disappear when the drone pulled out. It kept repeating like a cycle of blood, pumping back from the planet to orbit. Mark stood by the screen, his eyes hollow, as if he had seen heaven and then been cut off. Ben leaned against the cabin railing. His shoulders tense with anxiety. Drone Yarzo 9 carried a protein thread, a living gene fragment that had been inserted directly from Zorathia into the Odyssey module. Jonathan looked at the feed, saying nothing. To him, the Odyssey radar was more than radio waves. It was the palpitations of the plasma memory that swirled around Zorathia. A living planet that looked back, that kept what it saw, and that remembered who had touched it. The drone plunged back into the plasma cloud. The light of the seaweed above flickered like a phosphorescent ocean. Thick patches of plasma clung to the drone's hull, no longer ferocious, but not yet dissolved, like a milky skin around the gene particle floating in the probe's belly. Ben spoke up, his voice hoarse. When the drone returns to the module, what do we do with this model? Mark grinned, his eyes hardening. Keep it, separate it, sequence it on Odyssey. Don't be so stupid as to send it back to Earth. There, Vaughn will lock this sample in a steel vault, or sell it to some corporation that will turn it into a biogenetic weapon. Ben didn't object. For once, the most cautious Odyssey didn't scream, destroy sample. The living plasma, it was too late to destroy it. It was already on the probe. It was in drone Zorathia memory, seeping through the circuitry, merging with every ion engine vibration. Jonathan remained silent. His eyes were half closed. Over the steady ping of the radar, Vaughn's voice was like metal on a sealed coffin lid. Gathering all the data, no risk. Do not leave the safe module. But does Zorathia have a safety module for anyone? The drone touched the last cloud. Odyssey appeared as a tiny hunk of steel suspended above a sea of plasma that changed color blue-purple-red like blood flowing through a body that had never been exposed. Mark whispered just enough for Jonathan to hear, "You know. We just touched the foundation of a living city. It will open again. If we have the guts to dig deep." Jonathan did not reply. In his mind, the shadowy figure was still imprinted in the plasma. The face was embedded in the vascular tissue, a biological relic, a memory fossil. Or a reminder that Zorathia stored not just signals but people. Drone 9 drifted into the docking bay. The module door closed slowly, sucking in fresh air. A deep tone sounded, "Probe secure." The camera feed turned off, leaving only the Odyssey radar glowing dimly with a silent red wave. "Remember, we wait." Jonathan stood before the screen. One hand touched the radar glass, the plasma wave flickered like a farewell. But he knew this wasn't goodbye. This was a promise. Zorathia had opened the first tissue slit. That meant there would be a second, a third, and each time the drone penetrated, the vascular tissue would remember more of the human form, the memory form, the Earth biosphere cloud form. Ben cut the radar, and the Odyssey cabin slid into darkness as light as a curtain of sleep. But in Jonathan, remember, we wait, still pulsed like a pulse on his wrist. He turned to Mark, nodded, his voice drowned in the darkness of the cabin. "Okay, the observation doesn't stop. The drone is just the eyes. When the eyes are enough, the feet will come down." Mark chuckled, Ben didn't, but no one argued. They both heard what Jonathan had left unsaid. Zorathia didn't invite. She waited. And one day, I'll fall into her gut myself.